Hi, everyone. Thank you for coming. I'm thrilled that you're here for our Zerbe Zelebration with our guest speaker, Dr. Preston McLane. Really appreciate you all being here. It's been so illuminating for me to learn about Karl Zerbe. I really just knew about his birds, and that was kind of it. But in this project, I've seen, as you can see, his wide breadth of style and how he evolved, his experimentation with materials, and quite a lot about his personal life. I interviewed Linda Van Beck about him, and his daughter, Maria Zerbe Norton, and one of his students, Bob Smith. It's just been really, really educational for me, and I'm so thrilled that you're here to speak about him and help me learn a little bit more. So enjoy and welcome.
Hey everybody, so I'll introduce myself real quick. I may know some of you without your masks on, but as you've met before, I'm sorry if I don't recognize you right away, but please come up after my remarks and say hello. I'm Preston McLane. I'm the director of the Museum of Fine Arts at Florida State University. I've been back full-time at FSU in my current position for about 2.5 years, and I'm really glad to have the opportunity to come outside of our museum and programs and share with you my thoughts and what I've gathered in preparing some remarks about Karl Zerbe. What we really should be doing is spending an hour together looking at this wonderful exhibition, which I really want to say again, Al and everyone who's involved in making this exhibition happen. It's beautiful. It's a wonderful cross-section of time and mediums and subject matter. I've seen a lot of these works in reproduction, and you will recognize in the presentation, if you can see them back there, several of the pictures that I selected to make certain key points about his work are actually on display here in the gallery. And knowing the wealth of works that you have here within the collection of LeMoyne to draw from, it's wonderful that you selected some things that coincidentally I had prepared my remarks on. So I'm not someone who knew Karl Zerbe. I was born after Karl Zerbe passed away. And Karl Zerbe, however, of course, cast a very long shadow in Tallahassee and in the FSU community for the great time that he spent teaching and working with students, many of whom went on to have successful careers in the arts, both as an instructor in Boston and as an instructor at Florida State University. And pedagogy is really key to understanding Karl Zerbe's art practice, in addition to understanding the influence that he had as an artist. So what I've done is, in a rather conventional art history sort of way, I've put together a chronological presentation, but also presentations intended to touch on a few key aspects of his work. Once again, the resonance of my remarks and what Linda Van Beck put into quotes on the wall. A bunch of quotes could have been written into my presentation. You touched on some things which are obviously true about Zerbe because it's what people say over and over again when they remark about the artist, his personality, the influence that he had on people. I was also involved for some length of time in planning and preparing for the Zerbe Zelebration, but we also at the university are, and I was just talking about this before we got started, we have there's a lot of discussion going on right now at the university about what we should do with art history and what we should do with our inherited cultural wealth that has problematic content, right? Where you look at it and you're not sure how to understand what the artist might have been thinking in representing people from different countries and representing the female form and objectifying and sexualizing and having an approach to that subject that today feels a little bit awkward and it's difficult and we struggle to understand how to grapple with that art history. I'm going to be really candid and say that my presentation today ends with some questions about how we understand the difference between objectivity and objectification and how we do a good job of confronting this history, exploring it, recognizing it in its time, and also understanding how to continue to teach it and learn from it as part of our cultural inheritance, which Karl Zerbe represents. So that's sort of an outline of what I've prepared. I've got a stopwatch that I didn't start when I began talking, and so I'm going to start now. And I had planned for about 40 or 45 minutes of talking, but I also am I've been a lecturer for a long time at the university, and I do like to pause and ask rhetorical questions. And my favorite type of rhetorical questions are the ones that people actually answer. And maybe if you know Zerbe or you know his work or you have insights that you want to share, you can answer some of my rhetorical questions when I ask them. It would really help take the pressure off of me, because I'm not a Zerbe expert. My background in art history isn't in mid and late 20th century abstract art and expressionism, but I do teach a wide array of courses, and I felt like we could probably do a credible job of putting the marks together. So here you probably recognize this this portrait of Zerbe. We'll get back to this in a few minutes, but like I said, the academic side of me is never too far out of my mind, and so I'll start with and you won't be able to read everything. The presentation materials maybe can be available and shared with anyone who'd like a copy of this as a PDF. This is a brief timeline of Karl Zerbe's early life. He's born in 1903. The family moved and lived in Paris. His father was an electrical supply business executive. And so he was a person who was not of great wealth, but had means to travel, and he was educated, and they lived in Germany for a length of time. And he, for a very brief while, but it's something that was made kind of quite a big deal about, is that evidently for about a year or so, Zerbe studied chemistry, and he had a mind for chemistry, a mind for science. And this was something that he started on that path, but the artistic temperament took him away from the hard sciences. And yet, we'll see over and over again the excitement that he has about the mediums and the materials and the technology that artists can employ to create different surfaces, different colors, and different visual and textural effects are very important. So he moves around. He's now around 20 years old, and he moves to Munich, and he's starting to make art. This is a time when, if you know the general survey of art history, we have the German Expressionists, who in the pre-World War I and after World War I are painting these sort of radical, insightful exposés of urban life, and they're bringing color and shape and form that is a radical departure from the traditional academic realism, which we would associate with 19th century sort of a painting that would have been taught in the art academies and places like that. But it's a breakthrough that more and more the teaching that's happening within art academies is embracing these new techniques. And Zerbe is part of this youth wave of artistically inclined young people who are learning directly with people who were part of that radical, innovative class of painters who might have started in post-impressionism and expressionism around 1900, 1910. And so he's part of this youth movement to embrace and then continue these abstract expressionist techniques. So he's in Munich, and he's recognized as someone who can draw, and someone who has a beautiful kind of a graphic style, which his early work exhibits, and he can do things in an academic way. And by that I mean he can paint things that look like what they're representing, right? He can paint a bird. That guy really could paint birds. He painted birds from the beginning until the very end. And don't mistake the fact that in Tallahassee he painted a lot of birds as something that's local. Because as far as I could tell from surveying the history of what we know about Zerbe, he always loved painting birds, and they featured centrally in many of the compositions that he did from his late childhood through his adult life. So as a student in the city of Munich, he received a scholarship that allowed him to travel. He went to Italy, he went to France, he soaked up the atmosphere, he painted in nature. But he was also experimenting with techniques and mediums at this time, and he was never quite settled on something. Oil painted for a while, did some tempera paints and watercolors mixed with various binders that allow you to paint all plein air or outside. But his habits seem to have been more in the studio. And from what I've read about Zerbe is that he was a private person and someone who had an interesting, I should say, temperament, which he enjoyed working alone. He enjoyed being fastidious and fussy and spending time with his art, and did not do a lot of plein air work generally. He preferred to be in the studio. And yet he traveled and lived in Munich and got gallery representation at just the ripe young age in the art world. Is very rare when you're 20, 21, 22 years old and you already have gallerists who are picking up your work and selling it, most importantly, right? They'll give you a show, but then actually finding people to buy it is the trick. So he's selling drawings and watercolors and small canvases. And this is an exciting development for someone like Zerbe. And his youth and the energy that surrounded his art making put him on the radar of a number of really important gallerists who eventually arranged, he's in his 20s, for one of his works called Autumn Garden to be purchased by the National Gallery in Berlin. So a man not yet 30 is being identified as someone who has a bright future and is a part of this, not avant-garde, but certainly in conversation with abstraction and expressionism, but still dealing with subject matter that people enjoy, nature and portraiture and things like that. So it wasn't enough just to travel in France and in Italy. He took a trip to the United States. And so he's in his early 30s, travels to the US. He's there for a year, here for a year, I should say. And a lot of work that he produced during this time, we just don't have. We're not quite sure where it all went. And I do know that there are some passionate Zerbe collectors among us tonight who have made it one of their life's purposes to try to find pieces that have been lost and to recover them from the market and to bring them together in not really a study collection, but what is representative of the single most comprehensive, chronologically medium subject matter collection of Zerbe's work that you'll see anywhere, right here at LeMoyne. So he comes and goes from the United States, but decides in 1935 that he's going to return to the United States permanently as a permanent resident. And you can see here the types of things that he might have seen when studying in Munich. This is Joseph Eberts, who was one of his instructors that we know about. And you can see the style that Eberts brings as a German expressionist to this painting of Italy, something similar to what Zerbe himself might have produced at that time under the tutelage of Eberts. But right away, in the early 30s, we can see works that Zerbe is creating that are so representative of this personal, idiosyncratic style of a combination of still life and almost magical realism. Because what Zerbe does is he takes these motifs, interiors very often, very small, kind of claustrophobic spaces, fills them with objects of, I will say, sort of bourgeois objects of status and that have textures and that have reflections or surfaces that are interesting to explore, like this crystal decanter, which you can see represented, as is often the case with artists, in multiple compositions. You'll find there's an inventory of objects that artists tend to work from. They keep the things around, they paint them, they turn them, they look at them from the above, look at them from the below, and you'll eventually get to know all the things that Zerbe had in the studio. He also, as you can see, loved the birds, and this 1934 painting of Parrot and Decanter is maybe among the most gorgeous works of ornithological art that I think was produced in the 30s. So this picture, to me, shows so many of the characteristics of what we recognize in Zerbe's interiors. Like I said, low space, low ceiling, kind of tight, filled with objects that have some kind of significance, but you're not quite sure what to associate them with yet. And Zerbe hasn't come up with a vocabulary that allows us to read into the sort of symbolic meanings that we're going to see in some of his more mature works. So what else was going on in Germany in the 30s? Rhetorical question for the room. Nazism, right? And so now Zerbe, being a high concept artist who's wandering around and making beautiful artwork, is not immune from the impact that this is having on the world, on the art market, on friends and relationships we had with other artists who were deciding, for very good reason, that maybe their future wasn't going to be in Germany and they were leaving for the United States, leaving for other parts of Europe. And as a young man and as someone who had adequate means, but certainly not enough to go and like set up shop and live off the trust money that he would take with him, decides that he too would look for his future outside of Germany. And the context specifically, which is probably well known to you all, is the emergence of a philosophy of art and authoritarianism, exemplified by Nazi Germany in the 1920s and 30s, but then also we see similar phenomena happening in other totalitarian states in the Soviet Union and in communist China in the 1950s and 60s, which is an identification of abstraction and radicalism with dangerous philosophies, things which are confusing, things into which you can hide meanings and disguised meanings, and creating artwork that could be a vehicle for communicating things in secret has to be eliminated. You must have to understand on the surface of the work what it's intended to convey in order for it to be proletarian, or in order for it to be nationalistic enough to warrant purchase by the state and support by the state. And so Hitler, maybe you're aware, was a failed art student himself and had not made the cut when he tried to get into art school. And if only they had had the foresight to let Hitler into art school, what a difference the whole world would have been in the 20th century, right? It's crazy what these small things can amount to given time and insanity in not equal combinations. So what we see is a mass movement of the Nazi bureaucratic state to identify artists who are outside of this culture of nationalism and patriotism and white supremacy, and recognizing these Jewish artists or artists who are painting subject matter that reflects something degenerate, right? Something that comes from primitive cultures, right? And representing it in ways that seem to objectify that, but also to raise the possibility that there's some meaning, something significant that we could take from these other places, when in fact, according to Nazi dogma, all we need to do is get to know ourselves as people who are part of this great history of Teutonic master race theory. Yes, so these are not novel concepts. So the degenerate art undertaking was a bureaucratized, systematic listing of artists and seizing of artworks. And it wasn't enough to take the artworks out of public collections. They actually went to these links. They put it on display so that the public could come and learn what crazy people's art looks like. And they did this, I think it kind of backfired, because what happened is that these exhibitions became the most popular shows in town, and everyone wanted to come and see this art. And meanwhile, across town, they had a German art museum with great German art that nobody went to see because it was insipid and bland and lifeless and evil, because it mostly amounted to a lot of paintings of the Fuhrer. So, among the artists whose work was included in the Degenerate Art exhibition and whose work was ultimately destroyed after the show, which is the sad fate of this art, unfortunately, was, any guesses? Karl Zerbe. Yes, that very picture, Autumn Garden, that had been bought by the National Gallery in Berlin, was listed, inventoried as having been exhibited and then destroyed by the regime. So it's a fascinating moment in Zerbe's personal history. Now, at that point, he wasn't hanging around. In 1937, he had moved to the United States. But you can see here images of the way that this installation combined primitive artwork with art that was inspired by these forms. And Zerbe, too, was looking at non-Western art and drawing stylistic inspiration from things that came from tribal art, from indigenous art forms, but doing it in a way, and this is where it gets kind of sort of interesting, and this word that we're using it very often these days, problematic, is there's an objectifying of the subject and an effort not to understand it within its original context, not to be in dialogue with the creators or the holders of this cultural meaning, but to use it as a form of inspiration for formalist exploration. When I say formalist, I mean taking the superficial aspects of the work and then imagining something about it that is kind of filled out by your dream and your sense of exoticism and your sense of romantic associations with the source material. And we want to do a more thorough job of appreciating where these things come from and how they interact with histories of colonialism and histories of economic and military relationships that made this work available to collections in France, to collections in Germany, to collections in the United States. So I'll just touch on that to kind of give you the sense now of how we're trying to unpack that history when we're looking at art that was created and inspired by things that were, in some cases, literally plunder from conquests or military action or economic colonialism that was taking place in African and East Asian colonies. So with that context in place, and I'll show you an image here just so you don't have to believe me, a picture will tell you that the list that was kept by the Nazis, and these were, as you know, very methodical list makers, and they to a fault, they wrote down everything that they were doing, including listing the artworks that were going to be destroyed. And I teach a course at the university called, I teach two classes. One is Art and Cultural Heritage Law and Policy, and Art, Law, and Controversy. I didn't even do like a full-on introduction, but I'm an attorney, and I have a PhD in art history. And for about 10 years, I was in law practice and worked in government and took care of my family. I'm not taking care of my family quite as well as I used to, but I'm enjoying myself enormously in working at the university now full time. But my background in law and in art history has prepared me to do research and to teach and explore issues that relate to the intersection between the administrative state and law and art. So I couldn't help but include this little bit of history in the presentation today. So thank you for indulging. So one more, this is the last one more of these before we'll move on to some great pictures and talk more substance about Zerbe. So Karl Zerbe in America, right? 1937 to 1955, he's in Boston. And he's part of a movement, and I'll mention a little more details about this in a second. He was termed the Boston Expressionists because Zerbe brought with him German Expressionism and then turned it to kind of the New World settings and subject matter, right? Together with a number of other artists who moved to New York and to the northeastern United States. So he becomes, in short order, as a young man, the head of the painting department of the School of the Museum of Fine Arts in Boston. He does that from 1937 to 1955. And that's a whole career before he even found his way to Florida. He continues, at least prior to World War II, to spend summers in Europe, going back and forth, painting, meeting with people, and bringing art with him. And that's how we see pieces in the United States that he painted during the years that he still lived and worked for lengths of time in Europe. In 1939, he becomes a U.S. citizen. And then he travels in 1945. I love this one. I'm working on an exhibition right now focusing on circus. FSU Flying High Circus is going to be celebrating its 75th anniversary next year. And so the Museum of Fine Arts, isn't that something? 75 years of the Flying High. So we're going to be doing an exhibition in partnership with a number of groups to observe that awesome anniversary. So look for it next year. Fingers crossed, we're going to have a much more exciting year. Yes?
I was say Dick Puckett was part of that.
Oh, yes.
We're at LeMoyne.
I'm so grateful that you said that. I watched the movie. I had the pleasure of meeting Dick Puckett on many occasions before he passed away 2 years ago or a year and a half ago, about now. And so thank you for mentioning that. There's so much history around the circus. And in addition to that, which we're going to be talking about, Zerbe was a circus person too. He traveled with the Barnum and Bailey Circus and did drawings and did paintings, and he was inspired Harlequin and clowns featured in his artwork. So he does that for some length of time. He begins, yes, is there a question? Oh, okay. He begins at this time also, he's not yet 50, and yet significant cultural institutions are observing the accomplishment of Zerbe through retrospective exhibitions. The first of this is at the Museum of Contemporary Art in Boston in 1951, 52. He moves south. And there are a few things I haven't touched on, so there's other details that we'll get to when we look at some pictures. But he moves south. The way that it was described to me, or what I read, was that he had kind of come to the point where he realized there wasn't something left for him to do in Boston. He needed to be somewhere different. And the age, the warm summer climate year-round down here in the South was attractive. Nature was attractive, and I think more than anything, FSU at that time just lavished praise on him. They said, we love you and we want you here, and nothing is nearly as attractive as someone desiring you, right? And so as an artist who felt really desired, it was an easy decision for him to move, and he didn't look back, as I've read. So he becomes the president of a number of arts organizations too, and I think this is very notable, is that as a mature artist, it's easy to turn your attention away from the organizing of your discipline and of professionalism and being involved in continuing to work on behalf of young artists and practicing artists and art educators. Well, Zerbe, on two separate occasions of which I'm aware, did lead national arts organizations that focused on issues of equity, issues of economics, issues of access, and issues of liberty related to art practices. And the 1950s, of course, in the United States were also a time in which artists confronted questions of censorship, questions of whether you were with us or you were against us. We have hearings about whether we should be censoring art to protect us from the communist menace, etc. And so Zerbe was part of this as the president of a group called Artists' Equity in the 50s, continues to have exhibitions, and he becomes the director of the College Art Association in 1962. He serves in that esteemed role. That may be one of the not that there are, I should rank the things that are impressive, but to be president of the College Art Association is no small feat. And for Karl Zerbe to be among the people who served in that capacity speaks to his interest and service to the discipline. He retires in 1971. Here we are, 50 years later, observing the 50th anniversary of his retirement. Thank you for the inspiring date that allowed us to come together and meet and talk and share. And then, sadly, nobody wants to have a retirement that's this brief. Sadly, he passes away not yet a year after his retirement. And I understand that he recognized that his health was poor at the time of his retirement. And so Karl Zerbe left us at 69 years old. A lot accomplished during those years. Let's look at some of it. So Boston Expressionists, and I picked these three works because these are the three artists who are most often associated with this movement. Zerbe, you can see there, Beacon Hill. He painted similar scenes when he was doing urban or cityscapes in Europe. This is one of Beacon Hill in Boston, Hyman Bloom and Jack Levine. And right away, you can see these three artists are making paintings that are New World paintings. The Jewish community in, is it Squirrel Hill in Boston, which is the area of the city which has a great, denser concentration of the Jewish community. He's in and among this group of expatriates, many of whom were Holocaust survivors, many of whom had firsthand experience with losing members of their family, and yet who had continued to explore through expressionistic painting this really tense and traumatic nature of experience in the 20th century. So the Boston Expressionists are part of a group that we associate with formal artwork, which means an emphasis on color, an emphasis on shape, and yet they're also representational. They don't create radical geometric or non-representational artwork. You can always tell what they're painting, but they do it in ways that is sort of derived from the source material. And you can see here with the Rabbi with Torah, the Feast of Pure Reason. You have these figures who would be very much at home. There's another decanter. I do this to entertain myself when I put these presentations together. I'll pick something that just allows me to do a little riffing like that. So we've got another decanter there, but this is Jack Levine's decanter this time. I don't know if Karl Zerbe brought his decanter with him from Europe. But this group of Boston Expressionists are also centered around the school that Zerbe teaches at the Museum of Art in Boston, the School of the Museum of Art in Boston. Let's look at a picture which I think is very representative of his Boston Expressionist period. And the symbolic nature of what is built into this composition is much more kind of on the surface. We've got time, right? There's one thing which you'll see over and over again in Zerbe's work is that very literal depictions of clocks and flowers that seem to have kind of gone past their moment of greatest glory. You see here the skeleton, and he builds these sort of dreamy, almost surreal interiors, which I liken to a magical realist approach. The colors are not natural. That claustrophobic interior that we talked about is here again, where the ceilings are low, and we know from maybe our own experiences as children, spaces used to be much smaller than they are now. Everything's gotten so much bigger. Ceilings are higher. Rooms are. They shouldn't even put a sofa, a 21st century sofa, into some of these living rooms if you tried that people were living in at this time. And you can see that what Zerbe's doing is adapting the conventions, painterly conventions of the Cubists. You can see things that remind us of Picasso and remind us of the Spanish and French Cubists. You can also see things that remind us of those German Expressionists who had a kind of interest in the macabre, interest in the darker side of the human consciousness and experience. And then the Surrealists, right, who are taking a psychoanalytical approach and dream analysis and interpretation. All of these things are at work in a piece like this, Timepiece, which also is Zerbe experimenting with a new medium for him, which I'll mention in a slide or two. But he had enough reputation to be written about. And we were talking also before the presentation tonight with Linda, that when you go looking for history about Zerbe, I'm delighted to say you can find it. There are people who were writing in his time about what he was doing, some of it critical, some of it with lavishing praise. And what Linda said before we got started is it doesn't seem to have been like a middle ground. It's sometimes really tough to find that cool objectivity that we want with something that speaks with authority, because you have people who just loved him, and they loved him so much that they couldn't help but write all sorts of things that characterized him as this great champion of art and freedom and creativity. And you had others that thought that he was, could do better, and he was sort of on a treadmill and being a little bit, oh, there he goes back to the well again with another bird. So you can read both of those things and probably get a pretty clear sense of Zerbe in the process. But I have an excerpt from a journal article, 1941, and this is one of the authors who I'd say really did a lot to champion Zerbe and probably made it possible for Zerbe to have the longevity as an exhibiting artist that he did. And this is H.W. Janssen, right? And Janssen's name in the family looms large over 20th century art history. Again, German expatriates who came and brought with them the deep tradition of art history as an academic discipline. It was really invented in the 19th century in Germany as something that got studied and taught at universities. People moved on from those times, but in 1941, they were certainly still in control of the narrative. And if you will allow me, I'm going to read what Janssen wrote in 1941 in the journal Parnassus. And this is a cover image. His experience had made him immune against the dangerous tendency of his expressionist predecessors to reduce the elements of nature to mere graphic signs. His view of the outer world, though no less free from literalness than theirs, in other words, we could recognize what he's painting literally, retained a strong sense for the uniqueness of things and for the evasive charms of light and atmosphere. Often these sensations themselves came to be the main theme of Zerbe's work, and the tangible objects to which they were attached almost lost their identity behind a screen of iridescent and boldly handled color. In these pictures, reality survived only as a springboard for the lyrical mood the painter experienced in it. And so often I find that when looking at these pictures, and like I said, I looked at a lot of reproductions of these pictures. I'm delighted to be here today looking at the real thing. There's no substitute for it. You don't pay a lot of attention to what the object is. You don't think too much about the object. You're looking at it as a composition. You're looking at it as a mood, that lyricism, that the poetry of the objects without really dwelling on a particular narrative or story. If there is a story, it feels sort of obvious, maybe even cliche to some extent. I'll be critical for a moment. There's a sort of cliched aspect to painting clocks and painting wilted flowers and painting skulls. People have done it for centuries, really since the beginning of art making. So why did Zerbe do it? Right? Because within that space was something else that he was doing and looking for. Let's talk about that something else. And I believe that the biggest something else for Zerbe was the students that he worked with. And the fact that he kept making certain types of art because it was a way to show his students his practice. And if you one upside and downside to being in teaching as a profession is you kind of stay put and the students keep coming, right? And so after a few years, you kind of got it, you've got your shtick, and now you're going to stick with it, right? This is not a flattering characterization of university professors, and yet we all know that it's true to some extent, right? I've been teaching this course for 18 years, right? Well, and you probably haven't updated your notes in 12 of them, right? So, and I'm not accusing Zerbe of this, only to say that he painted a lot. And he made a lot of pictures that had similar things going on within them. Done differently, incrementally, changing it slightly, but you can see right away that as a pedagogical tool, he knew that he could teach around this type of art in a way that would make a difference for his students, maybe more than it makes a difference to him or to the art history to which he was contributing. And so, Karl Zerbe and his students, and I've got a couple of long-winded quotes, but I'll read one, and I hope you'll bear with me. Is that okay?
Yeah, sure.
Read the room, right? You'll give us another long-winded quote. All right. As long as we don't have to hear you talking, Preston, interminatively tonight. So this is Bernard Chiat, who was recalling his relationship with Zerbe during the time that he was a student of Zerbe's at the Boston Art School. And this was published in the Archives of American Art Journal in 1980. I'm going to mention something also that Linda and I also talked about, which is if you're interested in Zerbe, there's a treasure trove of Zerbe-related material at the Smithsonian Institution. His archive was donated, boxes and boxes of material was donated some years ago. And in 2019, I discovered that material was indexed. Now, that does not mean that you can access all the information online. They have not scanned it all, right? But you can read the contents of the files to know what's in there, what this box contains, what this file contains, how many copies of this are available for inspection. And there's a dissertation or two waiting to be written around that material. I don't know if any of you are interested in going back to school and writing a dissertation on art history, but there's certainly a lot to be researched around Zerbe. But here we're looking at an entry in the Archives of American Art Journal in 1980. So Zerbe has since passed, and this is a student reflecting on that time. Zerbe was the preeminent intellectual force in the school. His knowledge of the major movements of the 20th century put us in direct contact with a wide range of European developments. Oh, those provincial Americans, right? You need some Europeans to come and tell them about real art. He had lived in France, studied in Munich, painted in Italy. Picasso and Braque were his special heroes, and Max Beckmann influence during and after World War II was clear. Through Zerbe, their ideas permeated the school. Picasso was our living old master. We were influenced by the Blue Period, the Classical Period, the great still lifes of the 20s, and of course by Guernica. We were exposed to most avenues of European visual thought. However, some major movements were neglected or deprecated. Zerbe was close to it. Zerbe knew some of those guys. He probably had some resentments or some people that he wasn't all that fond of, right? And as a real person, he left them out of the curriculum if it suited him, right? He's going to pick and choose those things that excite him. The line from Cubism to Mondrian, for instance. We know Mondrian, the red, yellow squares, very, very jazz. It's just like visual jazz. Nothing, what is jazz music about? It just is, right? You enjoy it, but you don't read it like a book. The line from Cubism to Mondrian, for example. In retrospect, I cannot fault Zerbe. One painter-teacher cannot be enthusiastic about the whole panorama of the 20th century. That's good, candid feedback about somebody who had his syllabus and was sticking with it, right? This is when I get critical, right? You said I could, right? You said I could be a little playful, but also critical. And then during Zerbe's Friday lunchtime lectures, when he used to preach to all the painting students, this is continuing Chiat's recollections, believe it or not, against the dangers of Expressionism. So he would talk about how dangerous Expressionism is. Makes you wonder, has he flipped? Has he become staid academic? A little bit, just a little bit, right? They were giving him a paycheck after all, and it's very difficult to convince somebody of something that is inconsistent with the paycheck that they're receiving. In a lecture titled Third Generation Expressionists, this was Zerbe's lecture, Third Generation Expressionists. He defined the first generation, Soutine, Rouault, Kokoschka, the second, Bloom and Levine, his buddies back up in Boston, right, who he considered to be the second generation. Warning, he says, don't become a third generation expressionist. He's telling the students this. It is too narrow a range in which to develop something personal. And the sternest warning of us all was expressionists burn themselves out at an early age. Right? That's Zerbe's words, according to Bernard Chiat. Right? I think we can actually see in Zerbe's work maybe something that substantiates that that criticism, but also it's kind of, he admired the guy. He learned a lot from him. He was an important influence on him. All right, so let's look at the studio in which Zerbe practiced, literally, because we can see him here painting. But we also know that Zerbe's love of chemistry and technology as applied to painting. He was an easel painter, right? He did watercolors, he did printmaking, he did a wood block and lithography and silk screening, but really he was a painter. And he wanted to be able to paint in his way. My words are nothing. I believe it was Linda who around the corner on the wall mentioned that Zerbe, or it may have been Linda, or it may have been someone else who mentioned that Zerbe took to the medium of encaustic. We know about encaustic. You can see it all around you today, whether you know it or not. And encaustic had been rediscovered. Encaustic is painting with hot wax, right? And if you know, like when a candle drips, it gets hard really fast, right? You have to be very quick, and you have to have technology that allows you to maintain this pigment suspended in wax. And it's a combination of beeswax and linseed oil and in exactly the right proportions that give the artist the feeling that they can work with quickly enough for it to settle into the colors that then create this like gem-like surface that encaustic is prized for. Does anyone know, rhetorical question, but I'd be happy to hear how it is that encaustic was revived in the early 20th century? How do we even know about encaustic as a medium? No? Okay. Well, in the late 19th century, early 20th century, there was a lot of archaeology being done in Egypt, in Greece, in the Mediterranean. And the encaustic medium was used by the Romans and Greek and Roman Egypt for painting portraits. And they were, for a while, it was not clear, like they weren't sure what this medium was. They saw it and it was as fresh as the day it was painted. It did not degrade over time like so many other techniques which are suspended in mediums that have more volatility and that will darken or fade over time. Particularly popular among collectors and in museums as they began to build their collections around what was being discovered through these archaeological expeditions were likenesses of wealthy people in funerary portraits. And so a casket would include the face of the person who was being buried, painted in encaustic, in wax, which has pigment suspended in it. And they're really beautiful. And so check it out. You'll love what you find if you look up encaustic funerary portraiture. And of course, Zerbe in Berlin, in Europe, he's seeing these things, but the technology hasn't gotten to the point where artists are able to reintroduce it to their own studio. You need basically a hot plate or a set of hot plates that are dialed in at just the right temperature so that you're not boiling the stuff and intoxicating yourself in the process, right? Because if that gets hot, it's going to start off-gassing. And you don't want to hang out in that studio for very long because you'll get a splitting headache or you'll pass out. And so keeping it at the right temperature, having it work with the pigments that he's using to bring the colors. And you'll notice that the palette for Zerbe's paintings from this time are very restrained. I think it's worth observing that we see colors that evidently, when he's working with his encaustic, and you see here he's holding a torch, because not only do you put the hot wax down, but you can then apply other heat, an iron, a press, not direct contact, but just hovering above the surface so that it softens and melts and kind of settles into an almost mosaic-like or glass-like finish. You can see him working with his torch there. And you see that the blue and the yellow and the ochre and the browns. And I think it's safe to assume that this became the palette. Yes, it's wonderful. It's right here for us to see. This became the palette that he was working with because it was stable, because he could manage to create a work of art on the time frame that encaustic requires. Because unlike oil, where you can take weeks, right? And it won't dry. You can leave, go for a long walk, have a big meal, a bottle of wine, come back. It's as fresh as the moment you left the canvas, right? Some of those paintings of Van Gogh's are still drying in the museum where they're on display today. So Zerbe liked to work fast, and he liked to work repeatedly. And so here are 3 of easily 24 pictures that I could have shown you that date from this time when he's doing a lot of experimenting. And because he's trying to get good, he's turning pictures out, right? And he's also teaching the encaustic method. It came from Boston. It came from a relationship that he had with a particular scientist who was interested in art and art mediums, who was at MIT. And remarkably, Zerbe is associated with 2 breakthroughs in 20th century art making. Encaustic was something of a fad, I think, and for a while, a lot of people were exploring it, but it didn't stick around nearly as long. It became something of a precious specialty discipline because of its difficulty to work with and the need for the technology. And Zerbe himself had to give it up because he became allergic to the chemistry of the hot wax. And over time, like if you live in Tallahassee, like I have for so long, you discover allergies you never knew you had. Similarly, unfortunately for Zerbe, it became too much and he wasn't able to work with encaustic. But instead, he had something even better, which at the time was called Magna, but which we now refer to generically as acrylics, plastic paintings, right? Made with synthetics. The chemistry industry after World War II is going gangbusters, all sorts of new formulas, new stable pigments that are created in laboratories, that are created in great quantities, where before it would cost a fortune to get 2 tubes of blue. Now you can have as much blue as you want. Everybody gets blue, right? You are free to paint in the colors that you wanted to paint. And you can see the way that his art changes chromatically when he shifts from encaustic to acrylics. Just some examples of works from this period, pardon me. We have a portrait of Oster Korkushka. This is a work that there's an activity shoot for, I believe. This is a work that's in the collection of the Museum of Fine Arts at FSU. This is Polymer Tempura on Masonite, which is this kind of new magna form. It's 1949. It's an acrylic painting that is done with probably what was at that point experimental. It has this gooey, thick, heaviness. If you look at the surface of it, it's you could use it to grate cheese. It's a very deep, thick application of this medium, and he was working with it in ways that look and feel like encaustic. He was trying to find something that would emulate encaustic. And so for a period, you see this affinity between his encaustic paintings and his synthetic magna or polymer paintings. And then he just goes full-on acrylic painter and doesn't look back. Here's a polymer tempera painting from that period, which I started with. Very straightforward representation of the artist there with the clock in the back. And you can see this is one thing which we love to do. This is a classic art historian move, connoisseurship move, if you will. How do we know that these 2 paintings are by Zerbe, other than the big fat signature that's at the bottom? How do we know? I'm giving you guys a clue.
The hands?
Hands and
Color?
color can be.
Face?
You look for the small details, right? The small, yes, the ear, right? Look at Oscar Kokoschka's Vulcan ear, right? He's like Kokoschka as Spock, is what we got going on. This is before Star Trek, right? So credit where due. It was Zerbe's first, and then you can see that his own painting shows that same ear. This technique of looking at things that are so small that the forger would overlook them. Right? The forger is going to concentrate on the big thing. And if you're knocking them out and trying to make a living, the small stuff is where you're going to get caught. Right? This is back to the art and law things that I studied. So look for the ears, look for the fingers, the fingernails, the joints, right? Something that has a particular style that you can affiliate with the artist. And then right around the corner, this is a terrible, terrible photograph of this. I'm really embarrassed that it even looks this hideous. But you can see the painting around the corner. This is why it's always better to look at art in person than to look at a reproduction. Old man in a tree. And here we see Zerbe seated outside. I realize now that I've gone longer than I planned, and I will jump ahead. Hope this has been okay. Through some images to give you just a sense of Zerbe. One thing which artists always need is models, right? And Zerbe, he liked his models. This is part of the conversation that I've had with students about Zerbe. We were helping to prepare for the Zerbe Zelebration at FSU. And in doing this, and I didn't bring certain pictures, I figured we'd talk about a selection tonight of his work. But Zerbe did work with live models. And the setting of the nude, who is surrounded by mostly male artists who are leering at the person and drawing the person, and I know that was a loaded verb, right? But it's tricky to try to kind of to reconcile, right? Was that necessary? Why are they all naked? Well, the artists would paint themselves more often than anyone else, and so here we can see Zerbe as Harlequin. There we have Zerbe himself in the Harlequin costume, a photograph of Zerbe, where he took photographs and then used himself in costume as the basis for his own pictures, which then turned into what we recognize as this mature Zerbe in his 40s, 50s, into his 60s, doing figural expressionism, where you have antiquity. You have objects from the world around you. Here we have the circus influence that's at work here. The time he spent with the circus is clearly the tents and the draperies and the spectacular gilded wagon wheel associated with the traditional circus. And that antiquity too, and the love of the history which is embedded in our inherited past, the forms of sculpture, statuary, vases, and the fact, as we've observed, that his own art practice was an extension of discoveries that were made that put him as a 20th century art maker in dialogue with painters who were painting things in the 2nd century, right? And how exciting that feels to somebody to be part of that continuum and to continue those traditions. I will spare you this excerpt because it was the last thing I was going to read. But fascinating historical note, Zerbe gives testimony before Congress, and he is very concerned about the language that Congress people are using to describe artists as radicals in 1957. And he speaks with a strong moral voice of clarity that the question, would you be inclined to agree? This is Mrs. Green. Would you be inclined to agree that it is only the radicals or those being used by the radicals who are supporting this type of legislation, which is artistic freedom, right? Like artistic freedom is something that these crazy people who want to destroy America are trying to do. We need good, strong, moral legislation. Mr. Zerbe, I do not think so. Definitely not. I'm sure Mr. Williams and his group would probably benefit just as much from such a bill as what are called radical elements. If I may, I should like to say something about modern art, which after all has been attacked as communistic and all of that today, right? He's giving testimony. You guys would call it modern art communistic. Nothing is further from the truth, by the way, if you actually know what the communists were doing in the 1950s vis-a-vis art. It was insipid academic propaganda and kitsch. Modern art is very old by now, Karl Zerbe says. It's over 50 years old, and I'm afraid it's going to stay, regardless of what the opponents may say. Modern art is absolutely opposed to communism. As a matter of fact, art in Soviet Russia is not modern, it's not abstract, it's not any of the isms, but it is the most conservative and most reactionary art in a sense we could think of. Modern art is definitely the product of a democracy and not a totalitarian state. Karl Zerbe giving testimony. Isn't that something? Yeah, yeah. We need to hear that kind of voice. So expressions of nature, this may be the least I can contribute because you all know that he loved nature. He came to Tallahassee, he went outside, he coveted the birds and the weeds like here in growth from 1960. I'll just show you a few that I selected. Owls, there's two wonderful great owls. You can see that he painted images of nature, and then as you arrive at a point in your career where people are interested in acquiring your work, you create a series of prints, and you contract even with people who will help you to make the prints that are derived from your original composition so that more people can enjoy that work. And some of the Zerbes that exist in collections are Zerbe plus studio assistants very often. We work together with them to create limited edition prints. And LeMoyne was a huge part of making that happen. I mean, I love the fact this is a guy who he liked all birds. He was an equal opportunity bird lover, and the vultures got a little love too. This at the stairs, my goodness, isn't this just a triumph? What an amazing, and I had to come back to the parrots, right? Like we started with. And then there, these beautiful birds. And then here we are back in that closet of an apartment with his enormous decanter and parrot. And then he also blended figural work and birds into these angelic forms. He painted these angels, right? Like Uriel number 3, and here Ouro Preto number 3, which is this is from a trip that he took to Brazil. Ouro Preto, black gold, to translate literally. So black gold. And here's where I'll finish, which is this question of object and objectification. And we're not here to pillory Karl Zerbe or to use presentist kind of philosophy to undermine what he was doing. We're here to ask real questions about whether Zerbe used his experiences traveling in Latin America, looking at art that was quote unquote exotic or primitive as a source of inspiration to play with, or if he sought to explore and explain and understand the origins of this imagery. And it's not incumbent upon every artist to do all of these things, but to look at a painting like this and to say, did Zerbe see in the source material something human, or was it flat, and was it formal? And was it something that he looked at because it was interesting to look at, but not interesting to understand, or interesting to talk with, or interesting to really create a sense of equality and dialogue around? And some of the works that I think bring us to that question of understanding, which we can't answer, are works like Copacabana, right, which seems quite obviously to be someone who's being entertained, right, by the shimmying and the skin and the sensuality and the exoticism of the floor. And he watched TV. He came to television, interestingly, very late. He wasn't somebody who watched television until he was a mature man. But according to what I read, he liked it once he got into it, and he used it as a source of inspiration, including the series which was called Gems. And you can see that once again, he's taking the likenesses from the media, from popular culture. This is, of course, painted in 1967 at the same time that Andy Warhol was doing Maryland's, right? And Zerbe was not unaware of what was happening in the world of contemporary art, pop art. He had series of work that were riffing on that. But the face and why he chose it and what he intended to convey through his selection of faces of people of color is difficult to know without having the privilege of speaking with him or speaking with those who work with him. I do know from what I've read and in conversations I've had with others that when he addressed the civil rights movement, he addressed it from a certain passivity. he watched it on TV and he looked at what was happening, and it inspired him to make art, which is a step, right? But we don't know if he was looking at this from a anthropological standpoint or from a social activist standpoint. I think that the testimony that he gave, that I shared tonight, certainly speaks to the energy that he brought to issues of equity and issues of civility and decency. And so I tend to wish for the very optimistic read. But it's tough to look at some of those images and not see caricature and not see a kind of grotesquerie, which raises questions about what the intention of the artist was when they painted them. And then right around the corner, once again, here's this Untitled work, which is actually the last painting that I've shown. And the obviously the combination of sexuality and physicality and the bikini-clad kind of beach bunny subject matter is really hard to unpack when you look at it alongside other work that well, that's what I understand. Yes, and in 1969, to be painting Miami prostitutes is something that just compels you to ask why, and what was Zerbe trying to accomplish at this phase of his career. How can we understand this as a part of an arc of art making that has as much going on as we talked about tonight, without also wondering what his motivations were and what the goal of these paintings were as far as the meanings that audiences would take away from them. Was it the artist's intention to purely make objects out of these forms, or was there something more that was that had a social component to it that is difficult to read on its surface, and that we don't have testimony or writing or Zerbe's own voice to add to the discussion? Yes.
We do have one thing.
Please.
Please, yes. Zerbe did prostitutes.
You painted them.
And painted them on purpose.
Yes.
Okay, so he's nice for doing that. He goes for me and he puts up a little cloth from one of the pedestal. He doesn't say anything about it. Do you all know the story?
Yeah. No. And I don't know if can you come up so everyone can hear? Are you able to hear in the back?
It's
No,
just that
our guests in the
everybody
back
said,
cannot hear you.
oh, well, I'll wait a little picture. And it's there.
This is Linda telling us about her recollections of Zerbe and his late subject matter.
Zerbe made it to the top of the heap. And he is recognized as a meeting of many intellectual people. And he has a little pride. So he doesn't tell them that it's a joy. They think it's the latest in abstract.
Oh, I know this anecdote. I know the story.
Perhaps you know it.
Yes.
Anyway, he said, no, that's what I cleaned the floor with.
Yes.
And that's what the floor was.
Okay, so Zerbe had this is a story about how Zerbe was basically playing a trick on people who were pretentious and exhibiting abstract expressionism. Jackson Pollock's, Motherwell, Rothko. If you think about sort of American post-war radical abstraction, and playing with this by putting something forward as if it were a work of art, and in fact it was something that, apocryphal or not, was used to clean his studio. So I've heard that anecdote as well. I don't know exactly how that squares with the late subject matter, but I know we're running out of time, and I want to have questions or conversation.
I have a question.
Yeah, of course. I hope that everybody got what you came for.
Wonderful.
Okay.
Thank you. So photographers have gone around and taken pictures of homeless people, of African Americans, of prostitutes, and have been recognized as showing the humanity of these people who are often ignored and forgotten.
Yeah.
Now, of course, as you said, we don't know where Zerbe was coming from, but could that have been his motivation, that he saw a subject matter that you know, is not respected, is ignored, and he took it, because this piece over here, it's a beautiful piece. You know, it had beautiful color and glamour even. And so I think he represented that in a glamorous way, even though it might be prostitutes.
Yeah, I don't know. I don't know the answer. All I know is that looking at the long history of the way that the things I touched on, his experimentation, his dedication to studio practice, his dedication to teaching, and then coming to subject matter later in life that seemed to be more objectifying and not as objective in certain ways, just struck me and struck my colleagues, because every semester I have the privilege of working with students, and whatever I'm working on inevitably kind of trickles into conversations and work that we do at the museum and work conversations that I have with my colleagues. And we looked at works that Zerbe created, and we looked at works that students of Zerbe created, which the university also has a history and record of things that his pupils produced. And there was a clear shift in the 1960s towards the female form in ways that certainly did not feel fresh at the time, right? And this is where, like, if there was a moment in our history when this was innovative, it wasn't in 1969. And it wasn't a 67-year-old Karl Zerbe who was going to make that innovative leap into new ways of exploring social issues through easel painting. And yes, of course, the history of art is replete with examples of studio practice where women were made to disrobe and to be the object of the male gaze. And you can go and look at odalisques and to no end, right? And we know that they were boudoir paintings. And we know that the objectives of those paintings very often were to satisfy certain interests and appetites for the patrons who had the wherewithal to get artists to paint these things for them, from Venus on. And so, no, it's not incongruent with the history of art. It's just it's an odd kind of postscript in a way to a career that up until that point felt more rigorous and academic in a way that just didn't have this salaciousness to it. And when you see the salaciousness, you want an explanation, because for better or for worse, that salaciousness right now is the default assumption is that it's leery, you know, it's kind of creepy. I hope I'm not hurting anybody's feelings, but we don't know, right? But we do know that some of the work that students created in the 60s were men with their shirts tucked in and their horn rimmed glasses on and their paint boxes, sitting and painting naked girls. And is this a relationship that was in 1960s progressive? Hardly, right? This was not a progressive demonstration of what contemporary art was up to. It was, in a sense, the kind of reactionary approach to art making and academic painting that was being continued while other programs elsewhere were doing different things. And so from a pedagogical standpoint, a good dissertation about Zerbe is going to ask these questions. When you invited me to come, I promised that we'd talk about this just a little bit, but I also promised that we would honor our time and your time. And if there are questions, I'd be happy to do my best to answer them. And I'm grateful for you being here tonight. It honors me that you found time to come and listen to what I prepared. I mean that. I appreciate it.
Thank you.
Okay, great. So we can look at some pictures, or you can talk with me, or we can talk all together, however you guys prefer.
I have a question.
Powell, what's your question?
Well, something that I've been very struck by and Zerbe's work is his use of textiles and fabrics.
Yes.
And that seems relatively unique to me at the Expressionist moment. Can you talk about that a little?
Collage is not unique. And so finding things that are built into the composition, you have simulation of collage or pastiche, and then you have actual collage and pastiche. And very often those things work together. This is pretty common within 20th century what we call modern art. And so it's a formalist integration of material culture into the painting. Now, if there are particular types, like the lace, you can see a lot of lace and things. It could be, I could probably, if I went looking, find many examples of other art from around the same time that were doing these things and from times before. So he does it well, but it is not unique to Zerbe's practice. But he definitely was an artist who liked texture and loved to give his viewers something to look at other than a flat surface. And that's why it really rewards being admired in person. Hey.
Hi.
Ariel?
Yes. I have kind of a fun question, maybe. Maybe it's kind of silly.
Sure.
But do you think, what do you think was more influenced? Karl Zerbe influencing Tallahassee or Tallahassee influencing Karl Zerbe?
Oh, well, I wish I could say that it was Karl Zerbe influencing Tallahassee, but I think even today, for our Zerbe Zelebration, there isn't enough appreciation for not just Zerbe, but the many artists who have come and been a part of the city and the community through the university, through FAM and through FSU. And there are great artists who teach at TCC. And the influence that painter teachers have, and not just painters, but all artists have on the wider art world is understudied. Because we often put on a pedestal those artists who make their careers through a pure approach to art making, galleries, museums, and they never have to sully themselves with actually earning like a paycheck, except the commissions from the sale of their works. But the real world of art, and on Thursday this week, we're going to talk about this with another with a living artist, a contemporary artist, Michael Rosado, as a tie-in to the Springtime Tallahassee, but not spring, I'm sorry.
Sorry, it's okay, it's springtime.
Okay, it is. That was just
Yes.
Yes, so we have another event, day after tomorrow, I'll be attending,
Yes.
And we'll talk about that kind of question, right? With like, where is the influence? The community influences the artist influences the community. From Zerbe's perspective, I suspect that he'd think that it was the city that influenced him because he spent a lot of his time making art that was drawn from the natural world around us. Yes, hey.
I'm having trouble placing Zerbe in the wide pantheon of artists
Okay.
in America, in the world. Has he been recognized, this is kind of a follow-up on this Tallahassee question,
Yes.
has he been recognized in the marketplace of art for its value?
Yeah.
Or is he considered a backwater artist from little Tallahassee?
Okay. I have anecdotal information to share. But like I'm not an expert, but the things which I read and researched in order to come and be able to answer questions like that. So it's the limits of my knowledge, which are great. Zerbe's paintings are in significant collections. And so the fact that you can look at a list of great museums, right, like major city museums that have Zerbe's in their collection shows that there is a desire within collecting contemporary and modern art museums to have works that represent the range of German and American expressionist painting, of which Zerbe is a part. Through his German expressionist roots, Boston Expressionism, relatively small number of artists associated with that movement. A lot of Zerbe's paintings are in Boston-based collections. However, this is another drawback to being an academic painter, an academic and painter, a pedagogue. I know I use that word too often, a teacher and a painter, where you're making a lot of art because you're demonstrating to students a lot over and over and over again. He was prolific, and his prolificacy definitely diminishes the cost point of the work. There's just there are a lot of them out there, and I don't know what you can actually, I'll be honest, I don't know what you consider an expensive painting to be. So maybe I should caveat this, right? If you think a couple of $1,000s is like crazy to buy a painting, then yeah, his paintings are worth a lot, right? But if you put it into the bigger picture of what, let's say, major auction houses and major collectors would be selling and what they charge for it, Zerbe can be found for relatively modest sums relative to that. Is that helpful? And where he's situated, you know, he's a painter's painter. People who know him are going to know him because they're interested in the history of mediums and the history of this particular subset of art in the 20th century. It often happens that when artists take the turn to the university, to colleges, and make that their place in careers, they lose that cachet that comes along with the sort of celebrity artist who's just doing something pure. But the art speaks for itself, and you can see it and admire it and acquire it if you choose, which for a lot of people is a plus about Zerbe, let's say. It's not out of reach. Hey, what's up?
So along those lines of very prolific is, are there pieces that you could identify that you them as masterworks? That these are, these are.
Yeah, that's a great question. Okay, yes, I can. So the question is, are there pieces that Zerbe produced that are considered to be masterpieces? The work that most exemplifies Zerbe's art practice, usually they're going to be specific to a period. You know, what is Picasso's masterpiece? Is it Guernica or is it Demoiselles d'Avignon, right? Well, they're both masterpieces. They're from different times. I don't know. What I can say is that in researching for today's presentation, I did come across certain works that were reproduced multiple times. And they would be kind of the image that would be the reference image for a biographical sketch about Zerbe. Now, museums, of course, are going to show the works that are in their collection. And that's going to be what they'll use to represent the artist. And so the pictures and the form that seems to be most representative, if you were going to get a Zerbe and you wanted it to be like the iconic Zerbe, where you get your dinner party, people come in and then they kind of all like, oh, it's Zerbe, right? It would probably need to have some animals in it. It would be a still life, but within an interior. And it would have a lamp and it would have a clock, right? And it might have a piece of sculpture or a vase or a piece of statuary. It would have these elements of still life. He was a still life painter. No matter what else he did, yeah, he painted birds like he painted still lifes. And his still lifes became more and more attenuated and abstract later in his life, but you can still see his love of surface and his love of three-dimensional objects in space, and flattening it and playing with them was obviously it delighted him to no end because he kept doing it and seemed never to tire until the end. But yeah, that's what I would say. Maybe if I were going to look at a picture that just came to mind as I was standing here, I'd say if you want to know what a Zerbe picture looks like, this is a good one. That's a Zerbe. This one may be even better. The one down the bottom there. That one I saw a number of times, which has got a big old bass kind of hanging out right in the middle of the composition. And that's a really small picture from where you're standing. But that's the best I've got. But then again, others may feel differently.
I go for that.
Yeah.
Oh, the
This-
answer?
Well,
Oh,
the
this one.
answer, but this right here, the color.
So many
the
people have-
drama.
Yes.
Yeah.
Well, it's in a place of pride. We've got it right in the middle of the room. That's what, yeah, you bet. It definitely has Harlequin-like aspects to it. You can see that wonderful like pattern costume that is associated with Harlequin.
That's the one that most people have come in and asked, is that for sale?
Oh.
We're like, no.
How much are you at?
That one was kindly donated by Zerbe Norton, so
I see.
we're gonna be keeping that one.
Oh, yeah.
That's great. Well, I'm delighted that there are questions. Maybe if others want to get up and look around a little bit, I can hang out for a few minutes and we can talk some more.
Thank you very
All
much.
right.
Preston, I found that unbelievably interesting.
Oh.
So thank you for talking to us. I also want to mention that we do have Zerbe's serigraphs for sale here at LeMoyne for the celebration specifically. So if you're interested, let us know. All of his wonderful bird pieces that you'll see over in our Hooper Gallery over there. I just want to thank you for giving this talk. It's very illuminating to me. And I want to thank Linda Van Beck for being here. She's been a massive contributor to our permit collection. So thank you very much, and for all of your knowledge. And thank you guys for being here. This was wonderful.
For real.